Hey, it's me. How are you? Sweet. Um, Before I get into SNL here, a couple things. There's there's only 2 more weeks left, which is crazy. These summer classes go so fast. I hope you guys are enjoying the experience. Um, about the papers. So a couple of you have asked me about it. I'll throw it in here. I'll send out an email this weekend. Um, since you guys are commenting, I'm gonna I'm gonna sort of cancel the first paper, if that makes any sense. Um, and then I'll just have you guys do a paper at the end that'll be due on the first, like the last day of class, or over that weekend. Um, yeah, that's the fourth. So it'll be due the July 1st, or if you can get it to me that Saturday or Sunday, it's fine. Um, and I'll send out like topic suggestions and things like that. Uh, Probably next week at some point, and you'll have all the details. You'll know what to what to do. So your grade will be based on obviously your comments and that final paper, pretty much. Uh, so there's that for those of you who were wondering about that. SNL. I was happy to hear that most of you, unless you were just humoring me, but most of you who left comments said, "Hey, I like Saturday Night Live. I grew up watching it with my parents, whatever." Um, that's great. That's rare in my, in my uh, in my experience, and maybe it's not rare. Maybe it's just different. It's 100% different. Like I think the majority of your generation's experience with SNL is online via YouTube, right? Because Saturday Night Live itself, they basically post each individual sketch on YouTube so that you can go watch it there whenever you want to, right? It'd be interesting to see their viewership numbers live on Saturday nights and what those are. Um, but I would assume that they're not great. But I think a lot of people are just like, I'll hit the highlights, basically. Like, hey, there's my sports analogy coming back. I'll just watch the highlights tomorrow, you know. Um, but, oh, shoot, I just had an idea. And I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, it's actually, I mean, it was at the forefront of YouTube. Like they made a choice and a decision. It was a wise decision. And Lorne Michaels, he's old, but he knows how this shit works, right? And they've always done short films, but they sort of leaned into at a time when it was kind of controversial to sort of embrace the internet and things like that. Um, they leaned into it and they saw it as an opportunity. One of the first things I ever saw on YouTube, like the thing that made me aware of YouTube as a website, which for you guys has to be impossible to comprehend. was the Lazy Sunday Lonely Island sketch with Samberg, Andy Samberg, and Chris Parnell, the rap about the Chronicles of Narnia movie. And it was so funny and so new and so like, what? Like, this stuff, this is crazy. And then they did Dick in a Box, which went crazy. Um, but those were some of the first things that I ever saw on YouTube. Like, someone had to explain to me at the time, like, oh, it's YouTube and you just post videos there. Oh, cool. That has a chance to succeed. Um, so they've had to, we talked about, a bunch of you mentioned this, I mentioned this, it's an institution. There's, when you're on TV for almost 50 years, there's this ebb and flow. You have to change with the times, you have to adapt, you have to, and I think they've done a pretty good job of adapting to the digital age, um, and trying to stay funny and relevant. um, I think they've done a good job and topical, right? Like Weekend Update, you know, we talked. I posted the Hassan Minaj and the Onion stuff. Like SNL was a pioneer in comedy news, right? Weekend Update is one of the few things that has been consistent over the entire span of the show. Doing, at the beginning it was kind of just like silly news items, but now, with Che and Colin Jost, and even, in recent years with Tina Fey and Seth Meyers, Amy Poehler, like it's become, it's become a not on par with like the Daily Show and stuff like that, but in the discussion, they've always had that element of news. But one thing I wanted to talk about, big picture, and Tiffany kind of brought this up. Um, and a bunch of you brought up this idea that I did. Some of the sketches are bad, some are good. Like it's hit and miss. And I, my opinion is that none of the sketches are bad, but the sketches you think are bad just aren't for you, if that makes any sense. Because at the end of the day, SNL is a variety show. And you know what variety means, right? They're trying to they're trying to get their arms around everybody. There needs to be something for everybody on this variety show. That's why it's not all political sketches, right? That's why it's not all like physical comedy. That's why it's not all impressions. That's why it's not all the character work, right? Because they want to have something for everyone. So when you're like, oh, I don't like this sketch, think of it as it's just not for me. It's someone else out there likes it, right? That's what they're trying to do. That's why they bring in the celebrity host. That's why they have a musical guest. That's why they do the update in the middle, right? So there's this news, there's music, there's a famous character, right? Um, there's short videos. There's there's a political parody sketch, and then some of the stuff's just like completely highbrow, lowbrow. It's it's everything. Um, so that's a very challenging endeavor to sort of try to cover all the bases. And I don't think it's pandering. I think it's a it's an acknowledgement that, you know, everyone has a different sense of humor. Like not everyone thinks the same things are funny. It's what makes comedy so challenging. Um, I don't know if I made this point in my initial intro video, but even the funniest person in the world only has a sense of humor, right? Nobody has it completely figured out. They call it a sense of humor. So you might be in you might be tuned in a little bit more than some other people, but you don't have it all figured out. Will Ferrell doesn't have it all figured out, right? All these, some more than others, but for the most part, everybody still only has a sense. So it's tough to nail down. So they're casting a wide net, and that's I think why a lot of people sort of cast it off as, well, I don't like all the sketches. Like you're not supposed to. I think um, so. That's interesting, right? It's just a way to look at it that's I think helpful to understanding the context of the show is what it's what it's trying to do, right? Its intent. Um, and a bunch of you mentioned, I mentioned it in the opening intro thing or description or whatever. It's wait, why can't I think? Why can't I think straight? Oh, sketch. I think it's has the ability. A bunch of you mentioned it. I mentioned it to comment on the culture in real time, right? Um, they're doing it on a weekly basis for the most part, and a lot of times things can change on the day they tape, like on Saturdays. Something can happen Saturday, and they can react to it, right? So when things happen, it, you're doing something right if people are saying, I can't wait to see what SNL does with this, or it'll be interesting to see what SNL does with this, right? And I think that's a tip of the cap to SNL itself, but to humor in general. I think we're we're creeping slowly towards a culture that looks to comedy for answers. Comedians are the philosophers of our time. I refuse to accept any answer other than that. Um, so when you think about comedy, it, if you look at comedians, stand-up comedians, more specifically than others, we're starting to look to them for answers, right? Like, what does this comedian think about? Like, Chappelle's the big one now, but Carlin was like that. Louis C.K. was like that before his shit hit the fan. Um, Chappelle, I think Sarah Silverman. Like, there's a lot of comedians now that have moved into that space of just like not just being a clown, but being a philosopher and just yeah, like having interesting takes and usually open-minded takes because it's hard to be funny with a closed mind. Um, So I think that's a testament to the show. Like, oh, what's SNL going to do with this? And a bunch of you mentioned its relationship to South Park, um, and how um, it takes shots at everybody, right? Like that's it can't comedy shouldn't discriminate, uh, and it's takes shots at everybody, but also South Park is a show that sort of prides itself on being timely and relevant because they do it. They do their shows week to week when they're in season. Um, if ever anybody's seen 6 Days to Air, it was a special season 15 of South Park. It was a special that sort of documented them putting together the first episode of season 15, and it was it was really interesting because things were happening and they could plug it in very quickly, um, and it's always been like that. But one thing, and I think SNL sort of abides by this to some extent. Like the most important thing from that special was that South Park, yeah, now I'm talking about South Park. South Park doesn't start with like there's a scene in the writers' room. They're like, all right, let's build this season or whatever. And they don't start from the joke level. They start from the idea level. So it's like, what ideas do we want to talk about? And how then once they get the ideas, like this one's about politics and this one's about religion, this one's, those ideas, like big ideas. Then they bring in jokes to adorn the ideas. Like that's how it should be. If you think that South Park is just, oh, let's have Cartman say something ridiculous, and if that's how they build an episode, a bunch of shit jokes, and like Cartman says something ridiculous, the end, you're missing the whole point of comedy, right? Good comedy in this day and age doesn't work that way. It starts with an idea, and then how can we make that idea funny? And I think for again for easier digestion from you know audiences. So SNL does that to some extent, not quite as vigilantly as South Park does, but certainly a relationship between those two shows. So, um, South Park thing. A handful of you guys mentioned it. So, yeah. Um, yeah, so I think sketches, and it's tailor made for the internet, right? Like, little did they know doing sketch, and there's been a sketch boom. Like, there's tons of like little sketch troops and groups that have made their name on the internet. Um, who brought up Magic Hugs last week? Magic Hugs and Good Neighbor. It was like Mooney and Beck Bennett, and they like SNL has been mining the internet for sketch and improv, right? Sketch was born from improv, like the Upright Citizens Brigade theaters in New York that do classes on improv and sketch writing and all those kinds of things. And they provide the world with comedic actors. Chances are, if you see a guest spot on like The Office or something, it's a guy or a woman from UCB or Second City in what do you call it? Chicago, Improv Olympic, Groundlings in LA. So there's this in the early 2000s, this really this boom of sketch and improv happened. And not that it hadn't been, but before that, but primarily SNL used to search for its cast members through stand up. Like they'd get a bunch of stand up comedians, and then now, and some aren't great at sketch. Like Chris Rock is a perfect example. Like they got Chris Rock, and like he's one of the worst cast members of all time. He's one of the greatest stand ups of all time. It's just not his thing. I think Tracy Morgan's kind of the same way. Um, I mean, the list goes on, but I think they realized somewhere along the way that improv was more sort of more catered to a live sketch show than anything than stand up would, in terms of developing characters and all those kinds of things. So, um, your comments. I mentioned Tiffany, but Tiffany brought up the So Ghetto sketch, and Lou brought it up. A couple people brought up the So Ghetto sketch, and I just I think it's funny because it's representative of more than just the word ghetto, right? It's a language thing. And Lou made me think of this, like the way we use language and how inappropriately we use language a lot of the time. It's no different. It is different. There's less at stake with the So Ghetto, but it's similar to everything's gay, right? Oh, it's so gay. Like, but it's not really. You guys know what gay means, right? You guys know what ghetto means, right? So, like, these white women in the sketch, white women sort of appropriating the term ghetto to apply to things that are just like mild nuisances is disingenuous. Like, if people don't even think, they don't think about the words they use, right? And it's an epidemic. And I think it's interesting. Like, there's someone who's literally from the ghetto describing things from the ghetto. And it takes that for these other women to be like, oh, we probably we shouldn't be saying that, right? Um, so there's this hint of cultural appropriation, number one, but just the language that we use and how generally sort of how little we care about the words we say, right? So it's not as hurtful as the, oh, that's gay or whatever, that's so gay, but it has it's the same idea. Um, and, obviously the sketch is, it's exaggeration to the point of realization, right? You're watching, you're like, okay, we get it. But, like, do we get it? Like, because they do the joke, five different ways. There still are people who don't get it. Like, do we get it? Because people are still saying shit like that. Um, but yeah, it's a good. Obviously, all the sketches I put in the post, I think, are good sketches. Um, then Nick brought up the next for men, the deodorant for men about to be exposed for sexual harassment or assault or whatever, that one's a little cringy. And Nick, I'm glad you brought it up because this is a testament, I think, to the power of humor, the power of SNL, things like that. Is like they went there. I think we talked about this with, or I talked about this with Team America. Like it's comedy's supposed to go there. It's supposed to cross the line on controversial topics and have an opinion. So like I thought I don't want to say I don't want to say it was this was brave because then I'd be violating the language uh, issues that I just talked about that I was just talking about because it's not brave, but they they're like, what's happening now? And they did it. They've done a bunch of sketches about Me Too, the Me Too movement, where they're like, we have to do something about this, but it's such a volatile and touchy subject, no pun intended. It's such a volatile subject that it's hard, and I think some of the sketches they've done about it are like, this is hard to do. It's hard to talk about. And there's one where they're at the table, they're at like a dinner table, it's like three couples, and they're just having small talk, and then someone brings up like Me Too, and everyone's like, ooh, like, but the sketch itself, in a meta way, is like talking about it. Like, we have to talk about this stuff. It's like the Next for Men commercial is, I don't know if it's funny, and I don't care. Like, the fact that they did it shows some sort of, again, it's not bravery, but it's like we're gonna push this out there and people will react to it and hopefully they'll think about it, this stuff differently. um so I think that showed the uh the some comedy feels that it is responsible to make a statement, to make a sketch about this stuff. um Even the touchy subjects. Like again, make fun of everybody. We can't say that we're this sort of progressive comedy outlet without going after that. Now, do I think there's been a lack of Biden material coming from the admittedly left leaning SNL crew? Yeah, you know, there's plenty to make fun of with Biden, and I feel like they're not going as aggressively at it. That's where it gets dicey. Is you know picking and choosing. Like yeah, Trump's an easy target, so Biden's a pretty easy target. So that kind of that's been frustrating a little bit. Anyway, what am I doing here? Nick also brought up the Dudley sketch. A bunch of you brought up the Dudley sketch. The Dudley sketch is it's almost perfect. It's it's really funny, obviously, but the comments that it's making, right, are how what happens, and it ties into something else that Marco brought up. But the Dudley sketch is what happens to art when you take the audience into consideration, which is, you know, it kind of sounds counterintuitive, but art should be made for the artist, not for any specific audience. That's just my theory. The best art is created by the artist, unedited, unfiltered. This is my thing. And then an audience either likes it or doesn't like it. But with TV, especially, it's become this symbiotic relationship for some reason where, you know, a TV show airs and immediately people start bitching about it or praising it, and then the network just kneel and bend over and say, okay, you're right, and immediately tweak it and change it in accordance to, I don't know, 1,000 people, like whatever. And as you start to do that more and more, number one, slippery slope. Like, where does it end? That's part of the Dudley sketch. Is like, where does this end? And two, it ruins the art. So, if you have a TV show, let's say, and you wrote it, and it's this, you feel passionate about it, it's a great story, it's funny, blah, blah. Then you, as soon as you shoot that pilot, the pilot episode, as I mentioned before, purest idea, right? Closest thing to what the creator really wanted it to be. Well, then here comes the executives. Here comes the network execs. Here comes directors. Here comes writers. Here comes actors. They want to change this line. They want to change that. Then here comes advertisers. Well, you can't have this character say this because that'll offend our customers. And then you start pulling away. Okay, in this thing, take this away, change this character to someone like this. Then you get the general public. We like this character. We don't like this character. How could this character say this? All of a sudden, you start pulling away everything that was interesting about it, and you're left with Full House, or in your case, Fuller House. Like, which is, it's a fine show, but it's completely saccharine and, um, you know, just a shell of a television show. So that's kind of what the Dudleys sketch is about. It's like, if we're just going to listen to every complaint and change based on that, like what are we doing? Right? You're pandering. That's what they're sort of making this claim that, you know, especially in the sitcom genre, tends to pander to its audience. Be like, just give them whatever they want, which isn't, which makes for shitty art, if you ask me. Just give them whatever they want. So it ties into Marco, what Marco said about the Levi's Wokes commercial, which is obviously a commentary on the same thing, just in a different context, right? They're talking about the Dudleys with TV and being sort of pandering to as many people as it can, and it ruining the show. Not now in the Dudleys case, the show sucked to begin with, right? But you know what I'm saying. Um, the Wokes ad is, first of all, it ties into Inside and a lot of Bo Burnham's uh, bits about, you know, just corporate pandering for, you know, to increase profits by latching on to causes and movements. Um, got these nose hairs and I can't stop it. Um, but the wokes, and Marco brought this up. The wokes add. I just wrote this down. When you try to please everyone, you please no one. Right? Like that's that's like the theme of that woke thing. Is like these jeans, yes, they are not offensive to anyone, but they are not comfortable or for anybody either. So like what's the point, right, of doing all of this sort of pandering to consumers or audiences or whatever it is, when inevitably the Dudleys just goes back to what it was at the beginning. But there's um where's the other one? Someone brought up the Dudley sketch. The joke that you guys missed was at the end was like, who's doing the complaining, right? So initially, why can't one of the Dudleys be gay? Why can't the one of the daughter? Why does the one of the daughters have to be a ballerina, right? Like these are all complaints they got on Twitter, right? And then at the end, they're like, then we got your actual letters. And it's just like, not my Dudleys or whatever. So the distinction between the liberal, right, liberal complaints about TV shows and conservative complaints about TV shows. So, how are we supposed to make a TV show when our politics, sort of, our politics have trickled down to our choice in TV shows and what we want to see in a TV show, right? Um, the politicizing of shitty sitcoms is kind of the comment there, right? Because they make note, like, you know, the stereotype, obviously, of the liberal elite, right? Using Twitter and being very, very woke and progressive, and how about a gay character and all this kind of stuff. And then the basically hand carved, hand scrawled, like snail mail letters from rednecks in the Midwest, right? We're like, thanks Obama, like whatever it was. Um, so it kind of makes that distinction too in uh, that Dudley sketch. Lou, I talked about the the way we use language and things like that, and so ghetto and that's gay, like that kind of stuff. Um, Andrew, what is it? Andrew brought up. I know I wrote this in response to Andrew's comment. Political impressions can help shape opinion, like about like especially the presidents or people running for president. Like the Palin, Tina Fey's Sarah Palin, like really was a mind fuck for people, and I think really helped sort of change the course of that whole election. Um, and Polar that did I put the Hillary Palin sketch in there? Can't remember if I put that up for you guys. But like there have been kind of influential um like Trump, right? Baldwin's Trump kind of got ridiculous. And at some point it was like, okay, we get it. But then they they sort of morphed it like at the beginning, it was, oh, he's orange and he's an idiot, and like the easy stuff, like pot shots, basically. Then they realize like you can't sustain that. Like that's just not going to be funny. Still, like after 4 years, like that kind of humor doesn't have the staying power. So what they started to do, like a couple months into Alec Baldwin's run as Trump, they started to focus on what Trump was doing rather than, his physical appearance or like the easy shots that you can take at Trump. And that, holy shit. And that's way more compelling and interesting and funny. And it seems more ingenuous, if I don't even know if that's a word. Not, it seems more not disingenuous, which you would think would be being ingenuous. So, um, yeah, those political impressions really can, and that's where it kind of gets dangerous because I don't think it's comedy's job to sway opinion, right? It shouldn't be the intent of SNL to get you to vote, you know, Democrat. Like that, if that happens as a result of a sketch because you thought things through and think differently, fine. But if they're actively trying to do that, then they're no better than the politicians themselves, if that makes any sense. You remember I talked about bias. Comedy should be the least biased thing, entity out there that we can look to. And if it starts to get a little too biased, then um, that's dangerous, I think. Um, Marco, I talked about the Wokes ad. When you try to please everyone, you please no one. Actually like that as a bumper sticker or something. It seems to be true. I've said before, you'll never get 100% approval, so why seek any? Like, do your thing, and some people will like it, and some people won't. That's the end. that's 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 it. Um, Caitlin brought up the feminist song, which she had a different take on it than me. I think we're both right. But it's interesting to see these different perspectives. The whole feminist song, this is not a feminist song, right? The anti-feminist feminist song, right? It gets pretty convoluted as they go through the lyrics, and it's just a funny approach. Caitlin's take on it was uh, that through this lens, and maybe this is I'm a man, Caitlin is a woman, like the different lenses that we look through. Um, Caitlin's take was that the women in the song felt guilty or sort of felt guilty about doing a feminist song because of how men react to it. And she tied it into rappers and how male rappers can talk about their private parts, but female can't. Or it's a huge thing if they do. I don't, I hadn't thought about it that way. My take on it was always that it brings up how complex the idea of feminism is within the female, within communities of women, right? There's always these different factions of, well, you're doing it wrong, right? Here they set out to write this song for women and empowerment and all these kinds of things. And as they start, they're like, wait, how is this going to be viewed by other women who will say, right, the inconsistencies across the feminist movement, where, and this is a, this to tie into Caitlyn a little bit, might be, it's a product of male driven uh, media for the most part, is how we view feminism. So there are feminists who are like, this is how you be a feminist, and it's this way. And then there's others who say, well, no, that is archaic, and this is how you do it. There's, first, second, third, fourth wave feminists, and they're all sort of, the song is like, why can't we get on the same page, right? Why does this have to be so difficult and complex? And I think it ties into this idea of feminism that I call it Sex in the City feminism, where it's like feminism for many is just fucking and shopping, right? To be a woman, you gotta fuck a lot and whoever you want, and you gotta spend money, you gotta shop, you gotta love shoes and like all that stuff. Like that's showing them. And yes, that is part of it. There is a sexual liberation that has come with all of this. But I think men who run the media, take a show like Sex in the City, like, if we get everybody to think that this is feminism, just four women in their 30s fucking everybody and spending money without going to work, then that's a win for us, because now women are fucking more, and they're giving us more money. They're spending in this male space, basically. So it's this ultimate con, and Sex in the City was sort of like this pawn in the game. So that now, entire generation of young women grew up thinking being a feminist means just being hypersexual, basically. Um, and that's great, but that seems like it should be lower on the totem pole than wage equality and like actual equality, like things like that. So the feminist song kind of plays into that, like, wait, are we doing it wrong? Are we right? Like nobody really knows how to do this. Mom jeans, is the mom jeans sketch in there? When you've giving up, put on your mom jeans. You're not a woman anymore. You're a mom. Like mothers have largely been excluded from the feminist discussion because they've chosen to marry a man in most cases and have kids. That doesn't mean you're not a woman anymore, right? But when we think of feminists, you don't think of mothers. You think of like I said, like Carrie Bradshaw or something. But this is for an entire generation of women. So I'm totally butchering this description. Um, but anyway, I liked Caitlyn's take about the feminist song. That it's this male criticism that they're reacting to. But I would argue it's as much that as it is a reaction to women who will say, you know, you're not a real feminist because, you know, you did this wrong, you did that wrong. And a big problem is with any movement and gaining ground and making progress is getting everybody on the same page, right? Not easy to do. Um, and then Michelle, I talked about the up to the minute changes, right? That SNL can make and does make in many occasions. But yeah, that when I was talking about who's complaining, um, let me see this. Yeah, that's Michelle's comment made me think of they made the